I sat in the corner of that sleek restaurant, the kind with polished cutlery and menus written in cursive fonts, and watched them laugh over their wine glasses like strangers at a celebration I was never meant to be part of. My own birthday, 70 years old, and I had driven myself there, carrying the cake I had baked the night before, because no one else had offered. No candles, no toasts, no seat saved at the middle of the table. I was there, yes, but I wasn't with them. They glanced past me when I spoke, and one of them, my daughter, I think, waved a hand to quiet me just as I tried to tell a story from when they were young. As though my memories were interruptions, as though I had become background noise. That was the night they said it. Calmly, too, as if it were the most obvious truth in the world. We don't owe you anything. And something in me went still, not angry. Just still. I'm Margaret Ellison, 70 years old, retired schoolteacher, mother of 3. And that was the moment I knew I was no longer someone they felt bound to, not by love, not by gratitude, not even by blood. Subscribe, and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. Thanks, it's strange, really. You spend a lifetime thinking the bonds of motherhood are sewn so deep into the skin that they can't be unstitched, but that night I felt the thread snap. It didn't hurt the way I thought it would. It was more like a faint release, like the moment you realize no one's coming to help you carry the groceries, so you stop waiting and adjust the bags yourself. I paid my share of the dinner. Left a slice of the cake in the center of the table. No one touched it. I watched them walk out ahead of me, arms linked, full of wine and chatter. Not once did anyone turn back. Not once did anyone ask if I was getting home safe. I sat there alone for another half hour, drinking a cup of coffee I didn't want because it was the only warm thing left that evening. That was 3 months ago. And that was the last time I saw any of them. What followed wasn't some grand confrontation. There were no angry phone calls, no slammed doors, just silence on both sides, a silence I had once feared, but now welcomed like a blanket in winter. I suppose it didn't begin that night, though it had been building, hadn't it? The slow slipping away of tenderness, the way they stopped calling unless they needed something. The way my opinions became outdated jokes. How I started rehearsing my words before I spoke, afraid to sound too emotional, too needy, too old. But that night made it plain. That night stripped away the last pretense. We don't owe you anything. Maybe they meant money. Maybe they meant time. Maybe they just meant patience. Whatever it was, they made it clear that I was no longer someone to be cared for. I had served my purpose, and now I was an extra. I didn't cry. I didn't even go home and call a friend. I just undressed slowly, folded my sweater over the back of the chair, and stood in the doorway of my quiet little apartment, wondering how a life could go from lullabies and birthday candles to leftovers and voicemail silence. I remember walking to the window and pulling back the curtain. The night was unusually still, even for a city like mine. And I thought, not for the first time, that maybe it was time to stop holding on to what wasn't holding on to me. It was just a thought, a seed, but seeds don't stay seeds forever. That was the moment they let me go, and whether they meant to or not, I believed them. I suppose if you've never raised children, it might be hard to understand just how invisible motherhood can become. Not at first. No, at first, you're the center of everything. Every tiny hand reaches for you. Every sob seeks your arms. You are needed, relied on. And you rise to meet it, without question, because that's what love feels like when you haven't yet learned how to ask for anything in return. I was 24 when I had my son, David. A surprise, as they say, but not unwanted. I still remember the way he clung to my little finger the first time I held him, as though even then he knew I was his tether to this world. I didn't have much: a rented apartment, an old car that coughed in the mornings, hands that smelled of dish soap and formula. But I had heart, and I had grit. Then came Lauren, 2 years later. Born during a February ice storm that knocked out the power for a full day, I remember sitting in that delivery room with my coat still on, whispering lullabies as the nurses passed around flashlights. We used to joke that she entered the world determined to cause a little chaos, and in many ways she did. Ethan was the last, my quiet boy, always careful, always watching. He used to slip drawings under my pillow, misshapen hearts and stick figures holding hands. Long after the others had grown out of it, he was the one who'd wake up early on Sundays just to make me toast, even if he always burned it. 3 children. 3 whole lives I built my own around. There were years when I worked double shifts at the school, tutoring after hours, just to afford braces and violin lessons and class trips I never went on myself. I wore the same coat for 7 winters so they could each have new ones for Christmas. Not once did I think I was doing something noble. It was simply what a mother did. There was a stretch, the worst stretch, I think, when David was 12 and came down with pneumonia. I slept in a chair beside his hospital bed for 5 nights, didn't shower, barely ate, just watched his chest rise and fall, counting the seconds between each breath. I remember praying. Not even to someone specific, just sending out silent bargains into the air. Take my lungs, take my sleep, just let him breathe. When Lauren hit 16, she went through a mean streak. Most girls do, I've learned. She said things that stung, things she didn't mean, I hope. But even then, I defended her when relatives raised eyebrows. She's just finding herself. I'd say she's got a wild heart. She'll do something wonderful one day. Ethan had trouble with his reading. The teachers said he might be slow, but I knew better. I sat with him each night, sounding out every vowel, tapping letters on the table like music. He grew into his words, 1 page at a time. Years later, when he graduated college, the first in our family to do so, I thought he might look out over the crowd and find me. He didn't, but I smiled anyway. I kept every drawing, every lopsided craft, every Mother's Day card written in pencil. I still have them boxed in the closet under old blankets. I open it sometimes, not to cry, but to remember. I like the crayon smell. It takes me back to mornings when someone needed me to butter toast, tie a shoelace, mend a button. When love was loud and sticky and full of purpose. And then there were the quiet sacrifices, the ones they'll never know about. Like the time I gave up a weekend retreat with my sister, the first time I'd planned something for myself in years, because Lauren's ballet shoes tore and we couldn't afford both. Or the job I turned down, a promotion that would have meant longer hours, because Ethan's teacher said he needed more attention at home. They didn't know I was offered it. I never told them. There's something almost holy in being needed that deeply. You forget your name a little. You become mom in every breath and every room. And when the house begins to empty, when the beds aren't slept in and the laundry loads shrink, you realize how much of yourself you gave away, piece by piece, willingly. But I never asked them to owe me anything, never kept a ledger. All I ever hoped for was presents, a phone call, a birthday remembered, someone asking if I got home safe. I wasn't looking for praise. I was just hoping not to be forgotten. And so when they said it, when they let the words float out like steam from a mug, it wasn't just that they denied owing me anything. It was that they saw everything I did as owed, as if my devotion was expected, as if love had no cost and no memory. I think that's what people misunderstand about betrayal. It's rarely one sharp moment. It's years of giving and a final moment of being told it never mattered. And still, I can't bring myself to hate them. I don't have that in me. I raised them to believe they were extraordinary, that the world would bend toward them. Maybe I bent too far, too often. But I did it all with an open heart that I will never regret. It's just now I am learning how to give something to myself, and it begins with stepping away. It never came all at once. That's what people misunderstand: betrayal, neglect. Distance, they don't arrive like a thunderstorm. They creep in like fog, quiet, slow. You only notice it when you realize you've been squinting to see what used to be clear. I don't remember the last time David called me just to talk. I remember calls, yes, but they were logistical. Could I watch the kids? Did I still have that old receipt from the washing machine? And sometimes it was silence, voicemails left at odd hours, missed calls I returned but never got back. It became a sort of ritual, staring at my phone and trying to guess if I'd be remembered that week. Lauren sent me a message once, asking if I still had her baby blanket. The one with the yellow ducks. I did. I kept it folded in a cedar chest at the foot of my bed. I told her, of course, and offered to drop it by or send it. She never replied. 2 weeks later, I saw a photo online of her baby shower, smiling beside her new mother-in-law. The caption read, "My true mother figure. I owe her everything." It stung in a way I couldn't quite describe. Not rage, not even jealousy. More like standing outside your own house and realizing someone else has changed the locks. With Ethan, it was different. His distance wasn't cruel, just weightless. Like he no longer knew how to see me. He grew quiet after college, polite, distant, always too busy. I'd send little messages about the birds nesting outside my window or the book I was reading. I knew they weren't interesting, but they were me, reaching out, tapping on the glass. Sometimes he'd like the messages, that was it, a small blue thumb replacing a son's voice. But the hardest parts weren't the big moments, they were the little ones. A birthday card signed with just names. A Christmas visit shortened because traffic was bad. The way they talked over me in conversations, as though I was a child or a stranger. The polite patience when I spoke, as if they were waiting for their turn, not listening at all. I remember one Thanksgiving, the last I ever hosted. I spent 2 days preparing the meal, roasted the turkey with lemon and thyme, just how they liked it. Made Lauren's favorite sweet potato casserole with extra pecans. I even bought little napkin rings shaped like autumn leaves. They arrived an hour late. They didn't compliment the food. They scrolled on their phones during dessert. And when David said, "Mom, we'll just do it at our place next year. It's easier for everyone," I smiled and nodded, pretending it was a relief. I washed every dish alone that night. There's a certain ache in being phased out of your own traditions. I kept trying. At first, I offered to drive babysit. I sent gift cards on random Tuesdays. I remembered anniversaries they never told me they cared about, but each time, the silence after was longer, the gratitude smaller, the connection thinner. I started to feel like an obligation they were too polite to sever, and sometimes I wondered if they were waiting for me to fade on my own. There were signs I ignored, like how they started sending group texts instead of calling, how they'd tell stories I wasn't part of, laughing about things I hadn't been invited to. Photos posted online with captions like family night, and faces that used to be mine no longer there. But it wasn't just what they didn't do, it was what I stopped doing. I stopped sending care packages. I stopped pretending I wasn't hurt. I stopped baking their favorite treats for holidays when I knew they wouldn't come. I started measuring my words more carefully in our rare conversations, afraid of sounding bitter. Afraid they'd call me dramatic. I even stopped mentioning their father, my late husband, Gerald, passed 12 years ago. A heart attack on a Sunday morning. We were married 33 years. He was the bridge between me and the world, in many ways. They seemed to forget that grief doesn't end when the casseroles stop arriving. That being a widow doesn't mean you stop needing connection. They mourned him, yes. But they moved on faster than I did, and somehow I became a reminder of the Past they wanted to fast forward through 100 small wounds, none big enough to collapse a relationship on their own, but together they made a life feel cold. Rooms that once echoed with bedtime stories and piano lessons now held only the hum of the refrigerator and the occasional knock of a branch against the window. I began keeping lists. Not written ones, but mental, little ways I kept track of who I was outside of motherhood. I listed the birds I saw outside each morning, the flowers I could still name by scent, the poems I once knew by heart. I needed to remember I existed beyond them, that I had worth beyond what they failed to see. But even now, I question it all. Did I do too much? Not enough. Was I too soft, too firm? Did I smother? Did I fail to teach them what loyalty really means? The questions never end. They bloom in the dark, wild and tangled, and I pull at their roots, trying to find the one that explains everything. Still, there's no single answer, only a quiet ache and a growing truth. They weren't cruel, just careless, and sometimes carelessness is the slowest, deepest kind of wound. I used to think love meant never letting go. Now I wonder if it means knowing when you've already been let go of and stepping away with dignity. They didn't slam a door. They just stopped holding it open, and in the end, that hurt more. It was a Wednesday, cold, overcast, the kind of day where everything looks washed in grey. I had just finished watering the plants on the balcony. My violets were starting to bloom again. Stubborn little things when the letter arrived. Not a card, not a note, a typed, 2-page letter, folded neatly inside a crisp white envelope. The return address was from David's lawyer. At first, I thought it was a mistake, something about property taxes, maybe, or a clerical error. But when I sat down at the kitchen table and smoothed it open, the words hit like ice water down my back. It was a formal notice regarding the house. Not mine, not the apartment I'd lived in since Gerald passed, but the family house. The one we built when the children were still in school, back when Gerald was alive, and we were filled with the kind of hopeful debt you take on when you believe in a future. We sold that house after Gerald's passing, and I remember signing the paperwork with shaking hands. But apparently, David had listed me as a partial guarantor on his loan to buy it back later, a detail I vaguely remembered from a rushed conversation years ago. Back then, I had trusted his judgment, just like always. But now, according to the lawyer, David was refinancing, and in doing so, removing my name entirely. The letter wasn't a question, it was a notification. It told me that my name would no longer be associated with the property in any legal or financial way, effective immediately. I was no longer needed. It said, in dry legal language, no thank you, no courtesy call, no explanation, just erasure. At the bottom, my signature had already been provided. I stared at it for a long time. It wasn't my handwriting, not even close. They had forged it. I remember reading the letter twice more, slower each time. At first, I looked for some logic. Maybe it was just a placeholder. Maybe they had meant to ask me later. But the more I read, the clearer it became. This wasn't a mistake. It was a quiet decision made without me, a clean sweep. They had decided I no longer mattered, not in sentiment, not in legality, not even on paper. And that, I think, was the final untying, the moment the last string snapped. You can absorb a lot in silence, you can hold your breath for years, but there comes a moment, always, when you realize the air you've been waiting for isn't coming. And that's when you stop gasping. You just let go. It wasn't about the house, it was about what it meant, that after all I had given, all I had signed, sacrificed, trusted, they couldn't even offer the courtesy of honesty, that my name, the name that had once signed every field trip form, every doctor's appointment, every loan, had been copied without my knowledge, just to get me out of the way. I didn't confront them. I didn't call or send angry texts or show up. on anyone's doorstep demanding explanations. I folded the letter, placed it in the back of my kitchen drawer under a stack of old warranties and grocery receipts, and I stood at the sink, watching the wind pull at the curtains. I didn't cry. Not then. There was something colder in me. Now, not cruel, just done. That night, I pulled out an old notebook. One of those college-ruled ones with a soft green cover and pages that curled at the edges. I started writing. Not about the letter, not even about them, just about me, things I wanted to remember. Who I used to be before motherhood took up all the space, what I loved, what I still wanted. I wrote about the ocean, about how I always wanted to wake up to the sound of waves. I wrote about Florence, a city I'd once dreamed of visiting with Gerald. We never made it. Life, kids, bills, plans that got pushed back until one day they weren't possible anymore. I wrote about silence, not the silence of being ignored, but the kind I craved. The kind that lived in the early morning hours before anyone expected anything from me, the silence where I didn't have to be strong or patient or selfless. Just still in the days that followed, I moved differently. I cancelled lunch plans I didn't want to attend. I turned off my phone more often. I sat with my coffee longer. I started researching things, visas, small apartments by the sea, long-term rentals. I didn't know exactly what I was planning. I just knew I was. One evening, I pulled the old family albums from the shelf, the heavy leather-bound ones. I didn't do it to reminisce. I did it to decide. I flipped through pages of birthday hats and graduation gowns and backyard snowmen. I pulled out a few of the photos, just a handful, ones where I looked like myself, where my eyes hadn't yet gone glassy with disappointment. I left the rest in a cardboard box near the hallway, taped shut, marked simply with the word memories. I didn't plan to take them with me. The next week, I mailed a letter, not to the lawyer, not to the children, to myself. It was short. Just 3 sentences. You are more than what they chose to see. You do not need their permission to begin again. Take the quiet and build a life inside it. I held onto that letter for a long time. Then one day, I bought a one-way ticket, and I didn't tell anyone, not out of spite, but because I had finally stopped waiting for someone to ask if I was okay. I wasn't not then, but I would be. There's a kind of silence that isn't just the absence of noise. It's the withdrawal of presence, the slow undoing of a life. That revolved to long around people who no longer looked back. I didn't announce anything. I didn't slam any doors. I simply stopped filling the space they'd grown used to me occupying. I stopped calling, stopped sending birthday reminders, packages for the grandkids, little messages about violets blooming or rain falling sideways on the windows. I let their group chats pass by unanswered. The holidays came, and I didn't reach out first, no. Stocking stuffers, no mailed recipes, no invitations they'd forget to acknowledge. The first few weeks were the hardest. Not because they noticed, but because they didn't. That's the part no one warns you about. When you go quiet and the world keeps moving, it's both liberating and devastating. You start to understand just how replaceable your voice had become, how many things carried on without the shape of your love holding them together. I spent those early days walking. That was my ritual, mornings with a thermos of weak tea. A scarf looped once, then again. I walked through the neighborhood with no destination, watching the world unfold. I saw a boy teach his sister to ride a bike. I watched an old woman play sunflowers in a vase at the window. I passed by a coffee shop I had never entered. Not once in all the years I'd lived in that apartment. I walked in one day and ordered a cappuccino. The young woman behind the counter asked if I wanted cinnamon on top. I said yes. It tasted nothing like the life I'd known, and somehow that made it feel safe. In the quiet, I found small places to hide, the library, the botanical garden. A narrow bench under the elm tree by the old fountain, I read poetry again, not the kind that rhymes, but the kind that feels like a breath taken between two long thoughts. I wrote, too, pages and pages in that same green notebook, some about the children, some not, some letters I never sent, some questions I never answered. I reread the letter David's lawyer had sent me, not to reopen the wound, but to study it like a lesson. It taught me what I had been unwilling to learn. They saw me as past tense, a utility, a role that had served its function and could now be released. I wasn't angry anymore. I was learning to see clearly, to stop twisting every gesture into hope. I called a lawyer of my own. A soft-voiced woman named Elise who wore pearl earrings and listened without interruption. I didn't want revenge. I didn't want to sue. I just wanted to know what I still owned, what I was still tied to, and what I could walk away from cleanly. She explained everything with the kind of calm that makes you believe, just for a moment, that you're still in control of your own life. We restructured some of my accounts, cleaned up my paperwork. I took my name off a few old documents. I rewrote my will. That was the first time I used the word estranged. It caught in my throat, even though no one was there to hear it. I also started looking into something else, something that felt wild at first, a life outside this place, a country with softer winters. A coastline where no one knew my name. It started as a search, just maps and photos and articles. But soon, it became a habit. I bookmarked apartments, researched residency requirements. I joined a travel forum under a fake name, and then, one afternoon, while sitting in the corner of that same coffee shop, the one with the cinnamon, I booked a ticket, Lisbon, 3 months out, one way, no one knew, in the silence. I was laying bricks, not to build a wall, but a bridge out of this life, into one that asked less of me. Or perhaps asked just enough to remind me I was still a person, not a placeholder. I stopped telling myself stories about what might change. I stopped waiting for a phone call on Sunday mornings. I let go of the idea that I had to keep showing up just to prove I was still worth showing up for. I cancelled the family photo session I'd prepared 2 years ago. I donated the framed prints from the hallway. I packed a small suitcase under my bed, piece by piece, over the weeks that followed. One dress, one coat, a necklace I hadn't worn in years, a photo of Gerald, smiling in the garden with a watering can in hand. I kept my silence sacred, not bitter, not theatrical, just necessary. It became a form of peace, a language I no longer had to translate for people who stopped listening years ago. Sometimes silence is not the absence of love, it is the shelter that protects what little love remains. The day my passport arrived, I didn't feel triumphant, I felt settled, like a stone placed carefully in a river, no longer fighting the current. I was done asking for recognition, done offering parts of myself that would be returned unopened, and when the phone finally did ring, once, just once, from a number I recognized, I let it go to voicemail. I listened later, David's voice. Unsure, "Hey Mom, haven't heard from you in a while. Just wanted to check in." I didn't save the message, not because I was angry, but because I knew, deep down, he wasn't calling for me. He was calling for the version of me that stayed quiet out of love, not the one who had finally made peace with being unheard. And that version, she was gone, the morning of my flight. I sat in the quiet of my apartment for a long time, not rushing, not thinking too hard, just feeling the stillness, the walls that had once held birthdays and casseroles, silent phone calls and second chances. I walked slowly from room to room, touching objects as though they were people I was saying goodbye to. My fingers lingered on the windowsill, the chipped tile near the sink, the corner of the hallway where Gerald's coat had once hung. I wasn't Sad, I wasn't excited. I was ready. The taxi came just before dawn. The sky was still blue-black, the streets hushed. I gave the driver the address without trembling. I carried only one suitcase and a canvas bag. No fanfare, no notes left behind, no keys under flower pots. Lisbon greeted me with sunlight that looked like it had been brushed on by hand. The buildings were painted in faded pastels, and the air smelled faintly of salt and citrus. I had rented a small flat at the top of a narrow street. The kind that curved like a ribbon and forced you to walk slowly. That's what I loved most, how this city made slowness feel like grace, not weakness. There was a bakery on the corner. The woman behind the counter didn't speak much English. And I didn't speak much Portuguese, but we smiled, nodded, pointed to what we wanted. Some days I got a coffee and sat near the window, letting the language wash over me like a tide I didn't need to understand. My life became smaller, and in that shrinking, it became mine. I took the tram up to the old cathedral one morning, not out of faith, but out of curiosity. I sat in a pew near the back and watched the light spill through the stained glass. I thought of all the years I'd spent praying silently, not for miracles, just for enough strength to get through another day unnoticed, and I realized, in that moment, that I had stopped asking for strength. I no longer needed to carry anyone else's weight. I filled my days with simple things, reading books from the second-hand shop near the harbour, writing postcards I never sent, learning the names of unfamiliar spices at the market. I walked more. I ate alone without shame. I stood in doorways during rainstorms and watched people run for shelter while I let the drizzle soak into my sleeves. Once I found myself in a shop that sold old records and glass bottles. The owner, an elderly man with a lazy eye and a kind voice, gave me a discount on a cracked vase I liked. He told me, in broken English, not perfect, but strong, I carried it home wrapped in newspaper and placed it by the window. I liked how the morning light poured through its flaws. For the first time in years, no one expected anything from me. I didn't have to explain my silences or soften my sadness to make others comfortable. I could simply be, without titles, without obligation, without erasure. I began to speak again, not to them, but to myself. I whispered observations to the sea. I murmured memories while folding laundry. I hummed tunes I hadn't sung in decades, letting the sound fill the kitchen as if the walls were listening. One afternoon, as I sat on the balcony sipping cold tea, I saw a young woman helping her mother out of a cab. She held her arm gently, adjusted her scarf. They laughed about something small. The moment passed quickly, but it stayed with me. Not as pain, but as a reminder of what I had once hoped for and what I had released. I no longer checked my phone. I had removed the family group thread, unfollowed the accounts that made me feel like a ghost. My world was here now, not in the notifications I used to crave, but in the scent of bread from the corner shop, the rustle of laundry hanging in the breeze, the way the sunlight moved across the floor in quiet stripes. I found a local community centre that offered painting classes. I hadn't held a brush since high school, but the woman in charge waved me in kindly, like she already knew I belonged. I painted lemons and rooftops, and once a single chair by the sea. I wasn't good, but I was free. The silence I had once feared became the scaffolding of something gentle, not loneliness, but solitude. There's a difference, I've learned. One is a hunger, the other a meal you prepare just for yourself. I never made a grand declaration, never posted about my departure. I didn't send a dramatic message. I just stopped being available to a world that no longer made space for me. One evening, I received an email from Ethan. No subject line, just a few sentences. Hey Mom, just wondering where you are. We've tried calling. Hope everything's okay. I read it twice. Then I deleted it, not out of cruelty, but because they hadn't noticed when I was slipping away, and now their noticing came too late, and for the wrong reasons. It took time, but I stopped needing to be found. There's peace in being unlocated. It means you get to decide who finds you, and on what terms, and slowly. My life became something I wanted to live again, not a waiting room, not a holding space, but a dwelling, a haven. I didn't become someone new. I simply became someone full, whole, unanswered, and still more alive than I had been in years. It's a strange thing, watching your absence take shape in the lives of those who once overlooked you. It doesn't arrive all at once, like a thunderclap. It appears slowly. Like a shadow stretching across familiar walls, you can't see it clearly, but you feel it. The space you left behind starts whispering louder than your presence ever did. I didn't go looking for signs. I didn't check their profiles or fish for news. I had cut the strings quietly, and for a time I thought that meant I wouldn't feel the tug. But distance has a way of clarifying things. And sometimes people's recognition of your worth only arrives when your warmth is no longer within reach. It started with the second email from Ethan. This one had a subject line, "Where are you?" A longer message, more thoughtful. He wrote about how the holidays had passed strangely that year, how they all noticed the gap, how no one made the cinnamon rolls I used to bring, how the house felt quiet in a weird way. I imagined him typing the words, frowning at his own discomfort. Maybe he was starting to understand what it means to be missing someone who was always easy to ignore. I didn't reply. I wasn't ready to be summoned like a memory when the mood shifted. A few weeks later, I heard from my neighbour back home. Mrs. Lister, the widow who always borrowed my pruning shears and returned them with a new roll of twine. She wrote to me in a letter, proper and polite, the way she always had. She said Ethan had stopped by the apartment building, looking for me, said he seemed surprised that I was no longer there. That he lingered at my door longer than he needed. 2. He looked lost, she wrote, and a bit smaller than I remembered. It's not revenge, the way your absence begins to echo. It's simply reflection, a mirror held up not to punish, but to reveal what was taken for granted. Lauren, I heard, tried to host Christmas dinner that year. I imagine the roast came out fine. She was always competent in the kitchen, but I wonder about the quiet moments, the pause between courses. The way no one thought to bring out the old table runner, the one she once rolled her eyes at, because it was too dated, the one I stitched by hand during Gerald's last winter. Sometimes I pictured them, the three of them, in rooms I used to fill. Not out of malice, but to remind myself that I had mattered, that my presence had been more than background. I knew they'd feel it most in the small ways, like how no one mailed birthday cards in advance anymore. How no one remembered their co-worker's name from 2 jobs ago, or the soup they liked when they were sick, or the way they once dreamed of being an architect or a nurse or a poet. I had been the keeper of their stories, and without me, their narratives began to fade around the edges. I don't say that with pride, just clarity. You see, I wasn't their mother because of biology. I was their mother because I remembered, because I listened, because I carried their hurts like small treasures, wrapped in soft cloth and hidden in the drawers of my heart, and without that, they were suddenly untethered in ways they didn't know how to name. Months passed, then a year. I received an email from David, no subject line again, just 4 sentences. "We're worried about you. Please let us know you're okay. We miss you. I'm sorry." That one I didn't delete. I didn't answer either, because by then I had learned the difference between apology and restoration. Missing someone doesn't always mean you've changed. It just means you've noticed their outline, and I wasn't an outline anymore. I was a woman living in Lisbon with short grey hair and a sunspot on my left hand, a woman who drank black coffee and painted old doors, a woman who had learned the difference between noise and love. They hadn't just lost my presence, they'd lost the archive of themselves that only I had kept safe. That's what no one tells you when a mother leaves. What vanishes with her is more than casseroles and birthday gifts. It's the quiet stitching of identity, the constant holding of memory, the tireless forgiveness. Without me, their lives didn't fall apart. That would be too simple. They just started to fray. A little around the edges, loose threads where my hands once mended. Things before anyone noticed the tear. I sometimes wondered if they sat with their children, my grandchildren, and tried to remember how I used to sing, or which lullaby I favoured. I wondered if they told the truth, if they said, "She left," or if they said, "We lost her." Both are true, in a way, but only one carries the weight of why. I didn't watch from bitterness. I watched with distance, like someone who had left a house long ago and now saw it only from across a field. They hadn't burned the bridge, they just stopped walking across it. And by the time they turned around, I had built a new one that led somewhere far more peaceful. I wasn't punishing them, I was preserving myself, and in doing so, I became something they no longer had access to, not because I disappeared, but because I stopped waiting to be seen. It took me almost 2 years to write it. Not because I didn't have the words, but because I had too many, stacked like autumn leaves, damp at the edges and difficult to sort. Some were sharp, some were tender. Some I had rehearsed in my mind during sleepless nights in Lisbon when the wind rattled the shutters and the air felt heavy with memory. It wasn't a letter of confrontation, not a ledger of wrongs. I didn't want to write from the place where I had been hurt. I wanted to write from the place I had built since, the quiet place. The clean place, the one where my worth didn't need a mirror to be visible. I chose thick cream paper, the kind with a slight texture, soft beneath the pen. I sat at the little round table by my window, the one where the light spilled in just so around mid-morning. I had fresh tea beside me. My passport lay near the edge. A quiet symbol of all the things I had done for myself, and in the background, some distant bells rang from a church I hadn't yet entered. I began simply, "I know this letter may come as a surprise, but maybe not." Then I let the truth unfurl, not in anger, in honesty. I told them that I had left, that I had done so with intention, not haste, that I had chosen solitude not to punish, but to preserve, that the silence they found confusing was the only kind of peace I could still control. I told them I had been tired, not of being a mother, but of being invisible while still being expected to carry everything. I told them I missed the early days, the sticky hugs, the nights with fevers and whispered stories and soft hands reaching in the dark, that I had loved them completely, and maybe to long past the point they had stopped noticing. But I also told them I was okay, not happy in the way postcards pretend, not some sun-drenched fairy tale, but whole, that I had built a life in the cracks they left behind, that I had discovered I still liked the scent of lemon, the sound of waves, the way paint felt when brushed across canvas. I didn't ask anything of them, no reply, no apologies, no reunion. That was important to me, that they understood this letter wasn't a bridge back, it was a map of where I went, not for them to follow, just so they'd know I existed. Truly existed, after they stopped looking. Near the end, I wrote, "There is a version of me you never got to meet. She's quieter, but stronger, less patient with being forgotten, more generous with herself. She waters her own plants. She remembers her own birthday. She no longer waits for someone else to hand her joy." And I meant every word. I signed it with my full name. Not just Mom, because I had reclaimed the parts of myself that existed before they gave me that name, and the parts I had found since. I sealed the letter in a plain envelope and wrote all 3 names on the front: David, Lauren, Ethan. No titles, no roles, just the people they had become. I mailed it from the little yellow postbox at the bottom of the street, the one next to the flower stand. The woman selling carnations gave me a smile as I slipped the letter through the slot. She didn't know what it contained, but somehow her smile made it feel right. Like something had been laid down without needing to be explained. Afterward, I walked along the water. The breeze picked up my hair. The sun dipped low in the sky, casting gold across the tiled rooftops. I passed a man playing violin near the old square. He played something slow and aching, something that felt like both a goodbye and a beginning. That night, I didn't check my inbox. I didn't pace or wait or wonder what they'd say. Because the letter wasn't for closure, it was for release. It was a hand gently letting go of the rope I had clung to, even when it burned. It was a mother reminding her children, softly, and once, that she had been there, that she had given. That she had loved with an ache that never asked to be repaid, only remembered. And now she loved herself enough to leave the room without slamming the door. A few days later, I found myself painting again, not buildings or landscapes, just colors, soft shapes. I let them blur, stretch across the canvas in whatever way they needed. There was no meaning, and that felt beautiful, that something could just exist without purpose, without needing to be useful to anyone else. Later that week, I sat with a woman from the community center, widowed like me. She asked if I had children. I smiled and said, I did, I still do. Then I took another sip of tea. There was no sorrow in my voice, just a quiet truth. I had written the letter not to ask them to remember me, but to prove that I hadn't forgotten myself, and in that I was finally free. My days are soft now. They begin not with alarms or obligation, but with light creeping gently through the shutters, resting against the tiled floor like a secret I get to keep. I wake when I'm ready, not when I'm needed. That difference, that small, holy difference, has changed everything. I found rhythm in slowness. I make tea slowly. I peel fruit slowly. I breathe slowly. My world has contracted in size and expanded in depth. There's no rush anymore. No voice on the other end of the line asking if I can do one more thing, or be somewhere by a certain time. It's just me, and I've come to understand that being just me was always enough. I just hadn't been given the silence to feel it. The city around me hums, but it no longer presses in. I sit often on the stone bench beneath the olive tree near my flat. Locals walk by, children skip past, tourists pause to take photos of the ivy-covered stairwell just across the way. I smile when our eyes meet, but I'm never drawn in unless I choose to be. Once a week, I go to the Mikado for fresh bread and figs. The woman at the bread stall knows my name now. She says it with a lilting accent I've come to adore. Margareta, she calls, and every time, it sounds more like a blessing than a name. Sometimes I still think of them, David, Lauren, Ethan. I don't pretend I don't. The ache hasn't disappeared. It's just softened, like old paper. I wonder if they received the letter together, or alone, if they read it once and folded it away. Or if it lives in some drawer, taken out now and then like a riddle they don't know how to solve. I imagine they've talked, maybe even argued, maybe one defended me, while another called me distant. That's how families work, isn't it? Narratives layered on top of each other until truth is no longer fact. But feeling, I don't need to know how they interpreted my leaving. I'm not searching for validation anymore. I found peace without their understanding. It would be nice, yes, to be understood, but it's no longer required. Peace, I've learned, is something you build by hand. I built mine out of routine and ritual, out of walks on cobblestones and moments of stillness, out of old letters burned and new ones never sent, out of lavender oil rubbed onto my wrists before bed, and poetry books turned face down on my nightstand, out of not being spoken to and not needing to be. Some mornings I write, not always full pages, sometimes only fragments, sentences like weather patterns, brief, fleeting, honest, like, "Today the sky feels like mercy." Or being unneeded isn't the same as being unloved, or I am no longer waiting for someone to come home. I don't write for anyone else. I'm no longer archiving my life in hopes that someone will find it meaningful. These words are mine alone, a kind of proof that I am still becoming, even now. Last week, I met a woman named Beatrice. She is 73, widowed, an amateur potter. She invited me to join her for an afternoon workshop. I said yes, not because I needed new friends, but because I've learned the value of saying yes to things that are gentle. We spent 2 hours shaping clay in silence, the room warm with sun and soft music. My bowl came out uneven. I kept it anyway. There's a kind of dignity in things that aren't perfect. Sometimes I light a candle in the evenings and sit by the window just to listen. There are no voices calling for me, no one asking what's for dinner, no footsteps to anticipate, just the sound of my own breath and the way the wind carries through the alleyways. That quiet, it used to terrify me. Now it feels like home. I planted rosemary in a little pot on my balcony. It's doing well. I water it every other day and pinch off the dry leaves. Gerald used to grow rosemary in the garden behind our old house. I think of him sometimes, not with grief, but with gratitude. He would have liked it here, the rhythm of it, the way life unfolds like linen, wrinkled but clean. I don't pretend I have no regrets. I just refuse to live in them. If I could do things differently, perhaps I would have spoken up sooner. Asked for more, refused to let my love become so invisible. But I also know this. I loved as best I could with what I had. I showed up. I gave warmth, meals, forgiveness, presents, and when the time came, I gave myself back to myself. There is nothing small about that. I don't know what will come next. I don't need to. For the first time in my life, I'm not living in the future. Not planning my days around anyone else's comfort. I no longer carry the heavy hope that someone will finally realize all I did for them. I've laid that burden down, gently and fully. The world doesn't owe me clarity, but I owe myself peace. And in this quiet life I've created, far from the kitchen table where I once cried over missed birthdays and half-empty chairs, I have found something rare. Not joy, exactly, not closure. But the kind of stillness that hums deep in the bones. The kind that lets you exhale without apology. I wasn't angry, I was finally empty, and that was beautiful. It's been nearly 3 years since I left, and now, every so often, I find myself thinking not about the pain of leaving, but the strange and silent gift I left behind. Not one they asked for, not one they may even want, but a gift nonetheless, of space, of silence, of consequence, and perhaps, in some corner of their lives, of clarity. I've stopped pretending the past didn't shape me, but I also no longer feel like it cages me. I carry it with a kind of reverence now, like an old book whose spine is worn but still opens. And within that past is a truth I no longer avoid. I loved them enough to stay for years after they stop. Ed seeing me, and then I loved myself enough to go. That alone was the lesson, the gift, the final act of motherhood, perhaps, to show them that boundaries can be an offering too. A week ago, I received a letter, not in a mail, a letter, real paper. Real ink, handwritten, it was from Lauren. The handwriting was uneven, like she hadn't written by hand in years. There were smudges near the bottom. The return address had changed. A new home, I guessed, or maybe the old one sold. I didn't know. I didn't care to search. She began with, "I don't know where to start." And for the next 2 pages, she didn't apologize exactly, but she remembered. She remembered how I used to sing when I cooked, how I wore Gerald's old cardigan on winter mornings, how I wrote her name in Sharpie on the inside of every lunchbox, every backpack. Every ballet slipper. She remembered, and that was more than I ever thought would come. She wrote, "We've all talked about you. I think we didn't realize what you meant until you weren't there to explain it anymore." There was something in that sentence that struck me. What you meant, not what you did, not what you gave, but what you meant, because that's what gets lost in the noise of family, the meaning of a person, the quiet weight of them. The things they hold so others don't have to, the things they remember so others can forget. She didn't ask me to come home. She didn't ask anything of me at all. She just wanted me to know she saw it now, and maybe, in time, David and Ethan would too. I folded the letter slowly. I held it in my hands like something fragile, not because it hurt, but because I knew I couldn't return to what we were. There's no path back to a version of yourself that existed only for the comfort of others. But I placed her letter in the drawer where I once kept the one from David's lawyer, the drawer where my silence had once begun. It felt like a closing, a soft one. Not a door shutting, but a curtain falling. I haven't written back, and I may not because I'm bitter, but because this life I've built, this quiet, daily, deliberate life, doesn't bend easily toward the past anymore. It bends toward the light, toward the sea, toward the rosemary and the ceramic bowls and the woman I've become. Still, I think about them on days when the sky turns that heavy shade of grey that used to settle over our neighbourhood before a storm. I wonder if Lauren still drinks her coffee with too much cream. If David still drives too fast. If Ethan ever sings in the car the way he did when he thought no one was listening. I think about them in pieces, and that's enough. Not all gifts need to be opened. Some are meant to be left where they were placed, not as demands, but as reminders that love, real love, doesn't vanish when it goes silent. It changes form. It becomes something quieter, something that doesn't beg to be seen, something that simply endures. I gave them that gift when I walked away, the truth of what it means to be present, and what happens when that presence is no longer available to absorb the harm of indifference. Maybe they'll talk about it years from now. Maybe they'll wonder what Lisbon looks like in the spring, or if I still wear my hair short, or if I ever forgave them. But I hope they ask better questions than those. I hope they ask themselves who they've become in my absence, what they've learned about attention, about gratitude, about showing up while it still matters. And maybe, just maybe, they'll carry that into the way they treat others, their partners, their children, their own aging selves. Maybe they'll recognize the small kindnesses that are so easy to overlook, and they'll hold onto them. That would be enough for me, because despite everything, the silence, the letter, the walking away, I never stopped being their mother. I just stopped being their shadow, and in doing so, I gave them something I never had the courage to ask for, the knowledge that even unconditional love can choose itself eventually. I don't need to know if they ever thank me. I only need to know that one day, when someone holds space for them the way I once did, they'll feel it. They'll recognize the weight of it. And they'll remember the woman who once did it all, quietly, completely, and finally. Only for herself.